the most consequential 100 days of an American administration, certainly since Franklin Roosevelt, except this time for the bad. So what Donald Trump is doing is an American version of Mao's Cultural Revolution.
Where does this obsession with being a victim and this rage that accompanies it come from?
When you think of yourself as the victim and you operate out of fear, it gives you a license to do terrible things.
Welcome to this edition of the Fourcast from Washington, D.C. Now, it's been 100 days since Donald Trump was inaugurated here in the Capitol, and on that day he said the first 100 days of his presidency would be the most consequential and extraordinary of any presidency in American history. Well, you can argue about the definition of extraordinary, whether good or bad, but there certainly have been very consequential. Someone who's been thinking about that a lot, and in terms of the repercussions both at home in the US and abroad, is Fareed Zakaria. He is the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN. He is a well-known author, and Henry Kissinger, the doyen of international diplomacy, once said of Fareed Zakaria that he likes to say things that go against the conventional wisdom. Well, let's put that to the test. Fareed Zakaria, welcome to the program. I guess conventional wisdom has been one of the casualties of the first 100 days of Trump.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it's a deliberate effort in a way to upend the conventional wisdom and the conventional systems in Washington. In a very real sense, what Donald Trump is doing is an American version of Mao's Cultural Revolution. Just as Mao in the mid-1960s turned, the Communist Party's cadre, the young Red Guards, against the state, against the bureaucracy, against the technocrats, against the universities, against the cultural elites. Trump is in many ways trying to do just that in the United States. And of course, it has much greater international consequences, but it is in many ways an American cultural revolution.
I want to try and explore where that instinct for that revolution comes from, because one thing that's always struck me about Trump is that he's very good at weaponizing the victimhood, of America. America is being played like a sucker by other countries. The victimhood of, some, sectors of the population. I'm thinking above all about, workers in the Rust Belt. And the victim of himself. He is the victim of mainstream media, mainstream politics. Where does this obsession with being a victim and this rage that accompanies it come from?
It's a great question. I think he begins as an outsider. He is the Queens developer who came to Manhattan and was never really accepted by the Manhattan elite. So I think he's had that chip on his shoulder for half a century. But beyond that, I think it comes from, and Trump has this intuitive understanding of the resentments, the wounds, the slights that kind of outsiders feel. It's this sense of the country and maybe the world over the last few decades being run by a kind of elite technocracy, Ivy League educated, overly credentialed, urban, liberal, cosmopolitan, meritocratic. And Trump 2.0 is very much a reaction against that. And there's large numbers of people, and by the way, the Western world in general, who feel that, there has been too much of this kind of expert dominance. Michael Gove reflected this during Brexit when he said, we've had enough of experts, right? And Trump in many ways reflects that sensibility. And I think over the last 10 years, really, that sense has become greater because of a sense that the elites got Iraq wrong. They got the 2008 financial crisis wrong, and that they got COVID substantially wrong. Now, it's not entirely true that in all of those cases you can push back, but I think there is this narrative. If not for COVID, I think you would not have had the rise of Robert F. Kennedy, who really represents this idea that the conventional medical elite establishment doesn't know what it's talking about. That there's so it's a very broad skepticism of the rise of a technocratic, meritocratic elite, and Trump 2.0 has weaponized that.
I mean, a lot of the foreign policy, and I want to focus on foreign policy right now, is based on a supposed version of Trump's realpolitik. You know, we're going to take the rest of the world, including our friends and allies, to task. We're not going to be suckered on trade anymore, etc., etc. But it strikes me that a lot of the foreign policy coming out of this White House in the first 100 days is very emotional. It's not based on, you know, any big ideology or any doctrine. It's an emotional reaction to something that Trump has really kind of imagined in his own mind, but doesn't necessarily correspond to reality.
Precisely. If you go back to 1987, Trump, as a real estate developer, takes out a full-page ad in the New York Times, in which he castigates two groups of people. One, the Japanese, because they're taking advantage of free trade and, you know, hollowing out American industries. This is in 1987. And the second are the Europeans, who are free riding on American security. So these are Trump's, if he has any core beliefs, these are his beliefs. But as you say, they're beliefs that are kind of an emotional sense that America is being taken advantage of. The facts suggest exactly the opposite. Contrary to Trump's predictions, Japan did not take over the world. It did not dominate. In fact, it went into a 30-year slump, and the United States surged forward. Contrary to his view, the Europeans have not managed to benefit enormously from, you know, this dependence. They too have been left behind. The US has surged ahead of all other advanced industrial nations in the last 30 years. That is what the data shows. In 2008, the Eurozone economy and the US economy were the same size. The US economy is now twice the size of the Eurozone economy. So the facts point in one direction, but as you say, Trump has been able to nurture this grievance for a long, long time, and as a result, he has unleashed these policies which, you know, really have the danger of upending the international system, the open world economy, the rules-based international order created after World War II. And all of it is based on this very vague sense that people don't respect the United States, that they take advantage of it, despite the fact that all evidence is to the contrary.
Well, when he said the other day that the European Union, and I quote, was set up to scam the United States. I mean, you know, people in Europe would say, okay, we produce some great washing machines and cars that we've sold to you, especially from Germany. But on the other hand, this has helped America solidify its position at the very top of the global pyramid for decades.
Well, Trump has no sense of history, so he knows very little about what actually happened. As you know, the European Union was created largely with the impetus of the United States to try to effect a Franco-German reconciliation after World War II. It began with the European steel and coal community, and it was very hard to get the Europeans, who were both very nationalistic and very protectionist in many ways, to come together. This was seen as one of the great victories of a kind of American vision for the world and for Europe, a more open, more trusting, less competitive, less nationalistic, less protectionist view. Margaret Thatcher viewed the creation of the single market as one of her great accomplishments. And Thatcher was in many ways reflecting that American expansive vision. I think that, you know, Trump represents something broader, and that's what is worrying about it, that America has gone from a very broad, open, generous conception of its interests, in which a united Europe was good for America because it was another great pole of openness and liberalism and international engagement, to viewing it as a competition. And I've puzzled about why this is. Part of it must be that Trump really sees the world as a zero-sum game, you know, and maybe that it's a simpler way to understand the world. If you're winning, I must be losing, and perhaps that's the way he does his deals. But you know, you talk to any really successful businessman, and they understand the world is really a positive sum game. The more you succeed, the richer you get, the more you can buy my stuff, the world economy grows. You know, every individual may have a smaller slice of the pie, but that pie has grown so much that you're all richer and better off. That is not Trump's view. If you do well, he must be doing badly.
I just wonder then also to what extent the real change of the last 100 days is that Donald Trump sees the world in terms of hemispheres of interest and influence, and not in terms of values. And because he doesn't believe in those common values, he's able to throw his closest friends and allies, supposedly in Europe, so easily under the bus.
No, that's absolutely right. Look, he thinks in terms of realpolitik, and at least his version of realpolitik, which is, to quote Thucydides from the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they must, and the weak suffer what they have to. That is the way he looks at the world. And so to him, if you think about the world in those terms, you understand his sometimes bizarre statements about how Ukraine is responsible for the war. Well, if your view of the world is, look, Russia is the more powerful nation, when it bullies you, you have to accept that. You have to recognize that you are a satellite, a satrap of the Russians, and if you resist, you're messing with the natural way of things. And so, of course, it's Ukraine's fault in that view. It really seems that the people he respects are the strong. This which is, again, a kind of reordering of the way America has thought of the world. Since 1945, the US said, no, we're going to have a different world order. We're not going to go back to 19th century European realpolitik. We're going to create a world of rules, of norms, of values. And that was powerfully supported by a United States that would, for example, the United States did not recognize the Soviet annexation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic states, even though, of course, it happened on the ground. But the United States, as a moral principle, refused to accept that. The United States has never accepted, that conquest legitimizes acquisition of territory. And so Trump's view of it is not only kind of damaging in the short term, and poor Ukraine faces the brunt of it, but it's a much broader upending of something that has stabilized the world for 80 years now.
But also, this is the way that Americans have seen themselves. This is the way that American mythology has worked. We, America, we stand up for the weak if it's the right thing to do. I mean, I can think of countless movies, courtroom dramas where, it is the weak individual that is protected by some, a powerful, nation, uncle, godfather who believes in the right principles. And all that seems to have gone out the window with Donald Trump. And I just wonder to what extent Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, is the fundamental test case in which this is applied. And if it goes wrong, and it can go wrong in lots of different ways, the Western alliance, as it were, is finished.
Look, I worry about that as well. To have a situation where you ratify naked aggression, where you have the ratification really of the world's last multinational empire, Russia, trying to hold on to or to reconquer what it sees as its crown jewel, Ukraine. This would go against 8 decades of decolonization, of supporting the smaller countries, of upholding rules and norms and values. It is true, however, that there is still tension within Trump and the MAGA world about this. There are very powerful forces within the Republican Party and on the right in the United States that are very strongly in favor of Ukraine. Trump has not been able to get his way, not least because Vladimir Putin is not being helpful, because he is, in fact, the principal obstacle to peace, not Zelensky. But again, and I would be hesitant to say that it's the end of the West or anything like that, because there's a very large part of America that does not support Trump on this. There was a recent New York Times poll in which I can't remember, but it was something like 60 or 65% of Americans disagree with Trump's policy on Russia, Ukraine. So there's hope, and the West is stronger than any one event and one setback, and this would be a terrible setback. So while I agree about how important it is, we made terrible mistakes in Vietnam, we made mistakes in Iraq, we made mistakes. The British and French, I would argue, made a mistake in Suez. We came back. The West has a lot of internal strength. It will be able to come back. But Trump 2.0 is a very, very dangerous, is a very great threat to the unity of the West. No question about it.
Because even in those mistakes that you mentioned, you know, the Iraq War, the second one, the Vietnam War, these wars of choice, there was, you know, and Europeans went along with it, kicking and screaming sometimes in the case of the British government under Tony Blair more enthusiastically. But in all those cases, there was a kind of underlying sort of mattress of safety, if you like, that there was a convergence of values within the West between the US and Europe and Japan and South Korea. And I really think that in the last few weeks, only in the last few weeks, people have really fundamentally questioned whether that's still the case, and even if Trump were to disappear in a puff of smoke, whether the old values and the old alliance can be brought back to life.
The way I would put it is, for the last 8 decades in the United States, the debate was how to engage with the world, not whether to engage with the world. How to engage with Europe, not whether to engage. And Trump has brought back the old American isolationism, which says, a pox on all your houses, we're just going to do our own thing, and we'll beat you up if you threaten us. That American nationalism, that kind of Jacksonian tradition in America, has not been around since World War II. And Trump has brought it back. There's no question about it. And it does threaten the unity of the West and the unity of Europe. You know, in a sense, Vietnam and Iraq were cases where the United States was doing what it did in the mistaken view that this would help build a world of order and freedom and values, right? I mean, we might have been wrong, but the Vietnam War was about helping an embattled democracy, South Vietnam, against a communist aggressor in the North. Iraq was about spreading democracy in the Middle East. This time, it's about withdrawing from the world. It's about withdrawing from Europe, about detaching, decoupling. So it's much more worrying. But as I say, lots of people disagree with America. You know, America contains multitudes, and in a strange way, maybe Donald Trump is going to be a force for galvanizing a certain kind of liberalism and Western unity. What do I mean by that? He is showing us the consequence of what it would mean to have an America first, isolationist, disengaged policy, right? He's showing us what it would mean. It would mean the strong win over the weak. The law of the jungle prevails. You destroy U.S. AID and all U.S. humanitarian aid. You become a protectionist power rather than the avatar of free trade. And Americans are recoiling. If you look at the most interesting data about the United States recently that I saw, free trade was never that popular among the masses in America. There was an elite consensus about free trade. The support for free trade has gone up 20 points in the last 5 weeks in America. You know, it was at about 20%. It's now at about 40%, because people have realized, oh my God, you know, maybe we don't want all this. Trump is confronting us with the, you know, let's not just have the talk about it. Let's do it. Let's dismantle all these things. And it turns out people have an affection for the world we built.
I also wonder what you think of the fact that he's picking fights with people on just about every level, both abroad and at home. So here, one of the things that has really struck me is this sort of war against some of the law firms that have taken him on in the past, and of course, crucially, some of the elite universities like Harvard. In that particular battle, and the judges, by the way, who don't agree with some of his policies or some of his, you know, emergency decrees, in that battle on so many different levels, who is winning? Is it Trump or the opposition?
You know, with those battles, it mixes together a whole bunch of things, some of which are pure kind of narcissism on his part with the law firms, for example. Now, what he got from the firms was largely symbolic concessions, but it's a very bad precedent in a democratic country. And so it's very worrying. The longer term, you know, the larger battles are the ones with the universities. Now, let's be honest, he does have a lot of support on his side for this, and there is some cause for it. Universities have become too woke. They have attached themselves to fashionable causes like DEI at the expense of merit and excellence. And so there is a real issue here. The American universities did go a little too far in that direction, and it has provoked a backlash. And unlike the law firms, Harvard has staying power, and Stanford has staying power, and Yale has staying power. So I suspect that he will lose the battles against the universities, even though, ironically, that's a case where I think he actually had a reasonable critique. But because he's managed to take them on in the kind of blunderbuss fashion he is, I suspect that a lot of it will be ruled illegal by courts.
And of course, one of the justifications for his campaign against the universities is to stamp out any kind of anti-Semitism. And of course, there were some anti-Israeli demonstrations in places like Colombia. Some of them may have been anti-Semitic, but the suspicion is, even amongst senior academicians who are Jewish, that this is just an umbrella excuse to go after the so-called liberal intellectual elite.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that the universities he's going after, I mean, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, Harvard, Stanford, Brown, and Princeton are all actually run right now by Jewish American presidents. So the idea that they are, kind of engaging in naked and shameless acts of anti-Semitism is kind of a little bit incredible. I think it's fair to say that some of those protests, as you say, did get out of hand and did blur the boundaries between anti-Israeli criticism and anti-Semitic criticism. But I think we need a reset on all of this. I think we need to understand that it's a very bad idea for universities to get overly political. It's a very bad idea for them to attach themselves to fashionable causes. They do have to, however, be havens of free speech and articulating anti-Israeli thought and speech, and even, dare I say, anti-Semitic speech, is speech protected by the First Amendment. What is not protected is any kind of intimidation, harassment, bullying, and some of that did take place. But I think it's important for us to remember when drawing these lines that universities are meant to be places where people can express themselves with, and a lot of times the speech that comes out that needs to be protected is highly offensive speech. Free speech is sacred in America.
To what extent is Congress doing its job here? Because Congress has been bypassed, even though the Republicans have an albeit slim majority in the House of Representatives and a majority in the Senate. Trump hasn't bothered with Congress.
You're pointing to a very dangerous thing that is happening, which is the creation of a super-presidency. Trump has announced 8 national emergencies in his first 100 days. The reason he calls these national emergencies, so for example, when he's instituted these tariffs, he does it by saying there's a national emergency, essentially a kind of national security emergency. Why? Because it allows him to bypass Congress. It allows him to intimidate courts that are reluctant to rule on issues that the president has called a national emergency. Now, the whole thing is ludicrous. The idea that you could have a national security-based emergency with the entire world simultaneously, which allows you to slap tariffs on them, is prima facie absurd. And by the way, one of those countries that he slapped tariffs on is an uninhabited island full of penguins. Surely they don't constitute a national security threat to the United States. So the whole thing is just a get out of jail free card that Trump has been able to use, which is incredibly dangerous because it is a bypassing of the constitutional order. Now, the problem, and here we get to some of the flaws of frankly, that exist within the Constitution, is that the Constitution imagined that Congress would always push back, that Congress was the first branch of government, that it would, ask the president to simply execute its laws, not to take on these powers itself. But party has been proved to be more important than protecting the branch, the congressional power. So the Republicans in Congress are supine while he does stuff. Even symbolically, Trump seems to be trying to belittle Congress. One of his first acts was to fire all the inspectors general in each of the departments. These are congressionally created positions. And the law very specifically says the president can fire them, but he has to give 6 months notice, and he has to give a lengthy explanation for why each inspector general is being fired. Trump refused to do that. He fired them all immediately with no explanation or justification. Why? It was to prove that he can bypass Congress, and he can essentially flaunt congressional authority. And Congress did nothing. It didn't push back and say, no, these people are, and I think a court would have upheld, but Congress is not asserting its own power.
Whether it's Congress or whether it's the Supreme Court who ruled 9-0 against Trump the other day, even though he appointed the conservative majority in the court, do you think, Fareed Zakaria, that in the year 2025, the American Constitution that is 250 years old, that parchment piece of paper, is still doing its job? Or has someone like Trump been able to shred it?
It's not doing its job. It is under very severe strain. And I think if you read the Federalist Papers, Madison talks about the way in which American tyranny would take place. And it was not through some, dramatic act. It's through the slow accretion of powers, the slow accumulation of powers by somebody who was authoritarian minded. So this is exactly what is happening. I believe there will be pushback. I think there'll be pushback from the American people. Midterms are only a year and a half away. I think there will be more pushback from courts, which will insist that the Trump administration follow its rulings. And if you look at the polls on this, 80% of Americans think that Trump should obey court orders. Only 8% believe he should not abide by them. So there is pushback, but it's under very severe strain because you have an administration that is actively seeking to undermine the spirit of court rulings. So it pretends to abide by the letter of the law, but always finds some weasel way to get around it. It's very dispiriting. Now, it's worth pointing out that some of this has happened in the past. Biden tried to use an executive authority to forgive student loans, but when the court ruled against him, he abided by the court ruling. And that is going to be the key. So right now, the way I put it is we are in a constitutional contest, not in a constitutional crisis. But if you get a series of Supreme Court rulings that the Trump administration does not abide by, then you have a constitutional crisis.
So looking ahead to the next 100 days and beyond, do you think Donald Trump wants to govern, to rule like an authoritarian, like a dictator, and can he?
I think he does want to, and I don't think he can. I think the American system, while fraying and while the Constitution is under stress, does provide lots of checks. The most important check is the American people. And I think you're seeing already Trump's approval ratings. He has the lowest approval ratings of any president at this point in 80 years. I think they will get worse as the recession, as a slowdown hits, maybe a recession. I think at that point, congressional Republicans start leaving him. I think, let's be honest, everyone is a human being here. At that point, judges will get more bold. Governors will get more bold. The beauty of the American system is there are checks at so many different levels. Civil society will get more bold. Lawyers will get more bold. So everybody gets emboldened if public opinion is saying, yeah, we don't like what's going on. I think that is why the thing I worry most about is the changes he's affecting on the international stage, because all these checks are on the president's domestic power. Internationally, the president is a monarch and he has enormous authority. So he can upend the open trading system and free trade in the world. He can weaken NATO. He can severely damage America's soft power around the world. He's already done much of this.
So finally, Fareed, I just wondered whether, when you take all this into account, when you look at what you've described brilliantly, the kind of shifting tectonic plates, the change from values to interests, when you take that into account, is this the most dangerous thing, the most dangerous moment the world has lived through since 1945? And where does it end up?
this is the most dangerous period since 1945, because after 1945, the United States, with the help of Europe, set up a new international order, completely different from the hundreds of years that preceded it, and was an order based on rules and norms and an open economy and Western alliances and unity. But at the core of that order was an America that was deeply engaged with the world. And what Trump is doing is he is renegotiating America's engagement. He's withdrawing America's engagement. And that is actually the most dangerous threat to this post-1945 order. The rise of China, the return of Russia, these are all challenges that the Western world could face, the free world could face easily. In fact, in some ways, it galvanizes the West. But an American withdrawal, an American renegotiation, an American moving over to Russia's side in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, this is much more dramatic, much more dangerous, much more threatening to the kind of bonds that have created this world. I worry a great deal that what Trump is doing internationally is going to be his biggest legacy, his most damaging legacy, and the one that is going to be the most difficult to put back together. Because once you shatter the trust that the United States built over 8 or 9 decades, every country is going to be thinking, I need to buy a little bit of insurance, because if America could do this once, it could do it again. The Canadians will be thinking, we can't be that reliant on the American market. The Germans will be thinking, we can't be that reliant on American security. The Japanese and the Koreans will be thinking, maybe we need our own nuclear weapons, the surest form of insurance. And then you ask yourself, what kind of world is that, right? That's a world where you do get not maybe back to the law of the jungle, but to the rule of the strong and to the rule of the, it becomes more of a zero-sum game where everyone's in it for themselves. And we lose this extraordinary world that we created that has been responsible for more peace and more prosperity and the elimination of more hundreds of millions of people in poverty than any system that has ever existed before. And we're throwing it all up for nothing. I mean, we've managed to somehow convince ourselves that we are, that the United States is the victim of a system and a period where it has actually ended up being the dominant power in the world. Its companies dominate the world, its banks dominate the world, its currency is the reserve currency of the world. And yet, somehow, we are seen as the victim. And when you think of yourself as the victim and you operate out of fear, it gives you a license to do terrible things.
So really, depressingly, to sum up what we've just been discussing, you think the first 100 days of Trump have set the tone on the international stage, certainly, for the next 1,237 days or whatever's left of this presidency?
The first 100 days of the Trump administration have set into play forces that are going to be very hard to pull back, because other countries have to adjust, they have to adapt. And yes, it is probably going to be, from an international point of view, the most consequential 100 days of an American administration that I can think of, probably certainly since Franklin Roosevelt, except this time, not for the good, for the bad.
On that rather sober note, Fareed Zakaria, thank you very much for joining the Fourcast.